Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, March 30th. We start the cast with a look at the mass exodus of Ukrainian refugees fleeing war following Russia's invasion. The UN Refugee Agency says the number has risen to more than 4 million. Today's figure is a new milestone in the largest refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. The UNHCR says more than 2.3 million refugees have arrived in Poland. The agency also estimates 6.5 million people have been displaced from their homes within Ukraine. Back at home, Williams Lake First Nation Chief Willie Sellers spoke on Ottawa's role in advancing reconciliation. He says it should include support for economic development and key community needs like housing. But he is also looking for long-term funding to support his community's search for unmarked graves at a former residential school site in BC. Chief Sellers says his community and others need financial support for their work from start to finish. The Prime Minister visited Williams Lake First Nation as part of the government's reconciliation efforts. Afghan interpreters who help the Canadian military are planning to hold a hunger strike tomorrow. They say the federal government lied to them about bringing family members to Canada. They also say that people have been killed or interrogated by the Taliban while waiting for paperwork to be processed. New Democrat MP Jenny Kwan says the government should treat families of Afghan interpreters the same as Ukrainian refugees and process their papers once they are safe within Canada. Meanwhile, retired General Jonathan Vance has pleaded guilty to one charge of obstruction of justice following a months-long investigation into allegations of sexual misconduct. The judge has put the former chief of the defense staff on a 1-year probation and sentenced him to 80 hours of community service. Mr. Vance was accused of repeatedly contacting a woman and trying to convince her to make false statements to military investigators about their past relationship. He was not charged with any inappropriate sexual misconduct. Turning to Quebec now, where the Canadian press and major news organizations in the province have written an open letter urging chief justices to denounce a criminal trial involving a police informant. The letter was written to the chief justices of the Quebec Court, Superior Court, and Court of Appeal. The trial was held entirely in secret and only came to light because the informant appealed their conviction with the appeals court, issuing a heavily redacted ruling. The letter says it is unacceptable that a trial took place for which no official records were kept. It is also calling for an in-depth review to ensure it does not happen again. In Ontario, the housing minister introduced legislation today to streamline approval processes to boost housing supply. A task force that examined housing affordability in Ontario found that house prices have tripled over the past decade, outpacing income growth. Ontario's housing supply is 1.2 million homes below the G7 average. The move comes a day after Ontario announced it is increasing a tax on non-resident home buyers to 20%. Well, there is more fallout from last October's cyber attack on healthcare networks in Newfoundland and Labrador. The head of the province's largest health authority says more data thefts and privacy breaches have been discovered that could involve thousands of people. David Diamond says the personal data, which could include everything from healthcare numbers to medical diagnoses, was part of about 200,000 files found to have been stolen. Manitoba is making moves following a diagnostic and surgical backlog, estimated at nearly 168,000 cases. The province has released its latest plan to address pandemic-related demands on the healthcare system. It's going to support the expansion of the orthopedic surgery program at Concordia Hospital in Winnipeg. It will also spend $400,000 so more Manitobans can seek treatment for back pain and will continue to send patients to North Dakota for spinal surgery. The travel industry is slowly making a comeback from the pandemic. Air Canada says its capacity will be up about 150% compared with last year. But that's still only 75% of where it was before the pandemic hit. CEO Michael Rousseau says Air Canada has planned a strategy to return to profitability and increase long-term shareholder value. The Canadian men's soccer team is in action again tonight, looking to wrap up their World Cup qualifying campaign against Panama. With a berth in Qatar 2022 already confirmed, the Canadian men are looking to finish first in CONCACAF qualifying and earn valuable FIFA ranking points that could help in Friday's World Cup draw. Forum Daily will return right after the break, and when we come back, we'll be speaking with Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director of Appletree Medical Group, in our weekly medical segment about hospital avoidance during the pandemic. We'll have that and, of course, more news from around the world after that, so stay with us. We'll be right back shortly. An Alberta study in the Canadian Medical Association Journal shows there were fewer stroke patients during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, but a higher number of stroke-related deaths. Dr. Aravind Ganesh at the University of Calgary says the study found a decline both in the number of people presenting with strokes and those receiving stroke treatment. He says the numbers didn't improve in later waves of the pandemic. Dr. Ganesh says the study was done over worries that there was a trend, like those in other countries, of people not seeking emergency care during the pandemic. Joining us now to give us a deeper understanding of this trend is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Great to be here.
So what would you say are the main takeaways of this study?
Well, in this study, researchers looked at the data for about 19,000 Alberta patients from January 2016 to February 2020, and then another 5,000 patients during the first year of the pandemic. What they found was in the first wave of the pandemic, they saw a significant decline in the number of people who presented with acute ischemic stroke, which is strokes because of blood clots to the brain. Along with that, they found that use of stroke therapies also declined by about the same amount. Overall, the researchers found that the number of patients with stroke symptoms did not return to pre-pandemic levels after the first wave in spring of 2020. So I think the study and the research asks an important question. Did the necessary public health restrictions that we had implemented as a result of the pandemic result in some unintended consequences of dissuading people from attending the hospital for emergencies like stroke and heart disease?
That's really interesting, Dr. Raut. So what does this mean for patients in Alberta who are maybe at risk of stroke or stroke-related deaths?
Yeah, so the researchers were able to look at what happened to those patients by studying how people died due to strokes. They found that those out of hospital ended up having significant rises in deaths during the periods of the pandemic. The results were actually similar in hospitals. During the second wave of the pandemic and the third wave of the pandemic, more people ended up dying in hospital who had strokes. So the study looked at population level data, so it's not exactly clear why people decided not to seek treatment. But what it means for Albertans is that not seeking emergency care for possible stroke-related symptoms would have resulted in more morbidity and more mortality, which could have potentially been prevented.
And the study was conducted around concerns of a trend of fewer people seeking emergency care during the pandemic. Can you say that you've noted this across Canada, Dr. Raut?
Yes, I think what we've seen is that obviously Canadians have been advised to go to the emergency departments if they need urgent care. But from March 2020 to June 2021, there were approximately on average 9,000 fewer emergency department visits per day across Canada compared to the pre-pandemic level. So we're seeing quite a bit of a drop in multiple areas there.
Definitely some concerning information there, Dr. Raut. What other medical conditions can potentially go untreated or undiagnosed during the pandemic?
Yeah, so that's a difficult one because what we're seeing is emergency department visits for almost all conditions were down about 22% below pre-pandemic levels in that first year. So less urgent and non-urgent visits had decreased the most to about 28%. What we saw is children and youth had the largest decrease in emergency department visits. Visits for children from 0 to 4 decreased by almost 50% per month compared to pre-pandemic. And of course, there were certainly other things that we do worry about, many diseases, including cancers, that may have been undiagnosed during the pandemic.
All right, Dr. Raut, just about a minute and a half left here, but let's talk solutions. What do you think needs to be done to address this hospital avoidance, both during and following the pandemic?
I think this is tough because many of us have almost been hardwired into many types of avoidance thanks to so many years of the pandemic. But the essential thing here is to focus on educating the patient on the importance of going to the emergency department when they're concerned about something serious. I think we all need to be comfortable again to reach out to our physician or healthcare provider and talk about the preventative diseases, mammograms, pap tests, and FIT tests for our screenings.
And considering we're talking about strokes for this segment, what are the most common symptoms of stroke, and when should Canadians consider seeing a doctor?
Sudden numbness, confusion, trouble seeing, trouble walking, or dizziness, and of course, sudden severe headache of unknown cause. If we have any of these symptoms, the best thing to do is to call 911 immediately.
Definitely. All right, Dr. Rao, thank you again for joining us today for our weekly medical segment.
Thanks for having me.
All right, when we come back from the commercial break, we'll take a look at the open letter from gymnasts across Canada. Over 200 signatories are demanding that Sport Canada launch an investigation into abusive practices and the toxic culture prevalent in the sport. We'll be speaking with rhythmic gymnast Alex Landry to hear about her perspective on the situation. And of course, we'll have more news updates from around the world after that, so stay with us. We'll be right back here on Forum Daily News. More than 70 Canadian gymnasts want Sport Canada to launch an investigation into what they say is a toxic culture and abusive practices in their sport. Their open letter to Director General Vicky Walker states that they can no longer sit in silence and are coming forward with their experiences of abuse, neglect, and discrimination in hopes of forcing change. The athletes are calling for an independent investigation, saying complaints to Gymnastics Canada haven't been heard. And they aren't the only ones calling for change in their sport. Just 3 weeks ago, a similar letter came from Canadian bobsled and skeleton racers. Well, joining us now to give us her own account of the world of Olympic gymnastics is rhythmic gymnast Alex Landry. Miss Landry, welcome to Forum Daily.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So take us back to what led to this call for an investigation and what eventually broke this silence that gymnasts and former athletes wrote that they had to sit in for almost a decade.
Yeah, you know what? I think seeing all of the other athletes in different sports speak out about what's going on really is what broke the silence. You know, we have been quiet for so long and we need a change. And knowing that this is still happening, even when I haven't been in the sport for 10 years, is evident that we need a change.
And this letter goes on to point out there have been multiple complaints and arrests for emotional, physical, and sexual abuse in this sport over the past 5 years. But there hasn't been much change, has there, Ms. Landry?
No, there hasn't been any change at all. And knowing that when I was in the sport and we had complaints as well, there was nothing being done. So there's no change.
And in addition to abuse or sexual abuse claims, there are also concerns around overexhaustion and verbal abuse of athletes. So can you tell us a little bit more about these particular complaints?
For sure. So I believe gymnastics is a sport that requires a lot of repetition. We need to be near perfection at all times. And this just requires extremely long practices and in conditions that were horrible. We would used to train without air conditioning. We used to have horrible floors that we would jump on. And, you know, we used to be doing these things for 10 hours a day. And if things were not going right, our coaches would yell at us constantly. So these are just my experiences. And I know other gymnasts have similar, if not worse, experiences as well.
That sounds very strenuous, Ms. Landry. Can you tell us a little bit more about your own personal experience in the world of Olympic gymnastics and how it's been impacted by this toxic culture?
Yeah, so what's really unfortunate is that when I look back at my Olympic experience, the main thing that I think about is how horrible I was treated by my coach. I experienced constant shaming in regards to my weight. I was told that I was fat every single day. I was told that I was in unacceptable shape for the sport of gymnastics. My coach would re-choreograph our routine so that I would be at the back so judges wouldn't see how fat I was. So these are the types of things that I experienced every single day. And we had no one to reach out to. We were alone. We were often training out in Russia, in Bulgaria, in Spain. We had no support system. We were constantly with our coaches that were telling us these things. So we were very much impacted in more ways than one. And these are things that I had to deal with after the Olympics as well. So some things that have, you know, carried on in my personal life as well.
And how have these events impacted you in your personal life? You say it's been 10 years since you've been in the sport, but it's still affecting you.
Yeah, I mean, I do deal with a lot of anxiety. You know, I do have issues with my weight. I look at myself and I'm not happy with what my body looks like. You know, these are things that I'm constantly working on, but I know that they're tainted because of this is like the type of abuse that I had for 10 years, 11 years in the sport.
That's completely understandable, Ms. Landry. A minute and a half left here, but this letter says Gym Canada or Gymnastics Canada failed to address these matters. So what are you hoping of the outcome of an investigation from Sport Canada?
Yeah, honestly, I truly believe that all athletes should feel safe in the sport that they do. And I want this investigation to shed light on things that have been going on for years. And I want there to be a change. I want to protect the current athletes, the future athletes. And, I also want previous athletes to have some sort of closure on things that they have gone through when they were a gymnast. So, we've held on to this for so long. And I think people that were abusive need to be held accountable as well for the things that they've done.
Have you heard back from Sport Canada regarding this letter at all?
No, we have not heard back yet.
All right, Ms. Landry, thank you again for joining us and sharing your story with our viewers.
Thank you so much for having me.
Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we'll have more news from around the world as Russia targets areas it previously vowed to scale back from. Saudi Arabia and allies begin a unilateral ceasefire in Yemen. New COVID-19 cases fall while the number of global deaths surges. And the UK withdraws its judges from the top court in Hong Kong. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world when we return. So stay tuned. We'll be right back here on Forum Daily News. Ukrainian officials say Russian forces pounded areas around Ukraine's capital and another city overnight. The attacks come hours after Moscow pledged to scale back military operations in those places. The shelling further tempered optimism about any progress in talks aimed at ending the war. Russia did not spell out exactly what it planned to do differently. The promise initially raised hopes that a path toward peace was coming into view, but Ukraine's president and others cautioned that the remarks could merely be bluster. Moscow, meanwhile, reacted coolly Wednesday to Kyiv's proposed framework for a peace deal. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia says the kingdom and its allies have begun a unilateral ceasefire in the war in Yemen. The Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen says the move is aimed at creating a productive environment. This for Yemeni political talks about the war taking place in Riyadh. The Iran-backed Houthi rebels say they rejected the ceasefire proposal. Moving to the world's fight against the pandemic now, the WHO reports that the number of COVID-19 deaths worldwide surged by more than 40% last week to more than 45,000. But the number of new cases fell to almost 10 million. The WHO says the increased death count is likely due to changes in how COVID-19 deaths were reported across the Americas and by newly adjusted figures from India. Despite the global decline in reported cases, China has locked down Shanghai to fight an Omicron outbreak, which has caused the country's biggest wave of disease since the start of the pandemic. South of the border, the U.S. economy expanded at a healthy 6.9% annual pace in the fourth quarter of last year. But this is a slight downgrade from previous estimates. The U.S. Commerce Department says the nation's gross domestic product for all of 2021 jumped by 5.7%. This is the fastest calendar year growth since 1984 in the aftermath of a brutal recession. Previously, the government estimated growth in last year's fourth quarter at 7%. The Commerce Department says the small downgrade reflects a smaller increase in consumer spending and fewer exports. Germany's growth forecast for 2022 was slashed by the government's panel of independent economic advisors. This comes in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and concern over energy prices and supplies. The group is now forecasting that Germany's gross domestic product will expand by only 1.8% this year. Last year, Europe's biggest economy grew by 2.8%. Germany today triggered an early warning level for natural gas supplies amid concerns that Russia could cut off deliveries unless it is paid in rubles. All right, well, a major alliance has been formed by an organization of 7 Bay of Bengal nations. In a declaration on the final day of a 3-day summit, the group, the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, said its members resolved to work together to combat poverty, natural disasters, climate change, pandemics, and transnational crime. Leaders of Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Thailand addressed the summit virtually. In the UK, Britain has announced it will draw its judges from Hong Kong's top court, saying that remaining would legitimize oppression. The government says it is no longer tenable for serving UK judges to sit on the Court of Final Appeal. This because of the increasingly oppressive laws enacted by China, like the National Security Law. British judges have sat on the court since the former British colony was handed over to China in 1997. Meanwhile, the European Union is taking on the fast fashion industry and warning consumers to stop discarding their clothes like facial tissues. Proposed new rules call for a mandatory minimum use of recycled fibers by 2030 and would ban the destruction of many unsold products. The 27-nation bloc imported more than 80 billion euros in clothes in 2019. This was mainly from China, Bangladesh, and Turkey. A former Humboldt Broncos hockey player, paralyzed from the chest down on the team's bus crash 4 years ago, says the whole science world is insane and expanding every day. 22-year-old Ryan Straznicki is excited that a doctor has come from Thailand to reprogram the epidural stimulator he had implanted in his spine in 2019. The device sends electrical currents to the spinal cord to try to stimulate nerves and move limbs. And it's getting an upgrade, complete with mapping of the complex interaction between nerves and muscles. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.